The iron gate clangs shut not in a dungeon cell, but at the periphery of the known world, a remote, humid corner of the Korean peninsula called Gangjin. The year is 1801. A man stands stripped of his noble title, his power, and his freedom, reduced to the status of an internal exile, a ghost among the living. His name is Jeong Yak-yong, though history would forever know him by the pen name he adopted here, Dasan, the Tea Mountain. Dasan looks not at the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean that surrounds this desolate province, but at the rough, calloused hands of the farmer who has just brought him a bowl of thin rice gruel. It is the face of this farmer, etched with the scars of famine and the deeper wounds of administrative cruelty, that will become the primary audience for the monumental work he is about to begin. This scholar, once the favored prodigy of the reformist King Jeongjo, who designed magnificent bridges and modern fortresses, now possesses nothing but his intellect, his memory, and a searing, relentless anger. How does a man, exiled and powerless, rebuild a nation? How does a man, unjustly persecuted by the very bureaucracy he once sought to perfect, find the will to dedicate the next 18 years of his life not to lament, but to the creation of blueprints for flawless governance? This is the paradox of Dasan. His response to total defeat was the most profound act of intellectual resistance in Korea's history, the writing of the Mokmin Simseo, the Admonitions on governing the people. But to understand the true weight of this book, we must first understand the weight of the moment in which it was born. The Mokmin Simseo is not merely a philosophical text, it is a scream of righteous Han, a deep, unresolved sorrow and frustration, channeled into an exhaustive, uncompromising manual for ethical power. It is a work forged in the crucible of isolation, written for the ideal official who, Dasan knew in his deepest heart, might never exist in the corrupt world of the Joseon Dynasty. Imagine the ink on his fingers, smudged not from the smooth motions of court calligraphy, but from the furious pace required to capture solutions before they vanished into the thin air of his poverty. He was writing a guide for the shepherd of the people, the Mokmin Gwan, the local magistrate whose power, though geographically distant from the capital, held the literal life and death of the populace in his hands. The work's very title, Mokmin Simseo, translates to the Book of the Heart for governing the people. It suggests that governance is not an act of legal coercion or intellectual exhibition, but an intimate, heartfelt relationship. The true official must possess a specific kind of heart, one tempered by humility, sharpened by practical knowledge, and purified by an absolute, unwavering dedication to the weakest and most forgotten members of society. This emotional mandate, that the official must approach his people with the deep, protective love of a parent, was the radical core of Dasan's philosophy. Why this obsession with the local magistrate, the lowliest link in the massive chain of the state bureaucracy? Because Dasan knew that the ultimate failure of the Joseon state was not in the abstract principles debated in the capital, but in the specific, daily, physical suffering of the populace in the provinces. The grand philosophical debates over Li principle and Chi vital force meant nothing to the farmer watching his grain seized by a corrupt clerk. The state's collapse was a grassroots tragedy, and only local, ethical action could stop the rot. Before we open the pages of the Mokmin Simseo, we must breathe the poisoned air of the time, the context that made Dasan's desperate intellectual labor a matter of national survival. The atmosphere of late 18th century Joseon was thick with the dust of decay. It was an agrarian society, rigid and deeply stratified, where lineage was destiny and the Yanban, the hereditary scholar-official class, monopolized power, privilege, and access to learning. This was a society theoretically guided by the lofty principles of Neo-Confucianism, stressing filial piety, ritual propriety, and the moral cultivation of the scholar. Yet by the time Dasan reached maturity, that philosophy had ossified, becoming a brittle shell protecting bureaucratic self-interest. The political system was paralyzed by relentless internecine Dongying, factional strife. The major factions, the Noran Old Doctrine and the Namin Southern Doctrine, to which Dasan belonged, were locked in a vicious cycle of purges, banishments, and revenge, often disguising political rivalries behind subtle, abstract philosophical disputes over obscure points of classical doctrine. The capital, Hanyang, hummed with scholarly arrogance and political intrigue, utterly divorced from the grinding poverty of the countryside. The great engine of state failure was the systemic corruption of the Somgyong, the three main pillars of taxation: land tax, military service tax, and grain loan administration. These systems, designed to ensure stability, had become instruments of mass exploitation. Imagine the scene at a provincial office. It is not the formal magistrate, the Mokmin who executes the daily corruption. It is his subordinates, the local clerks, the Aemin, who form an entrenched local power structure. The magistrate, often appointed for a short term and frequently uninterested in local affairs, delegated power to these clerks. The clerks, masters of local knowledge, land registers, and legal loopholes, would manipulate the records. For the farmer, this meant that the land tax, Jeong Yak-yong, was calculated not on the actual harvest, but on inflated estimates manipulated by the clerks. The military service tax, Gangjin, initially a requirement for able-bodied men, was levied even on infants, the disabled, and the deceased, a practice known chillingly as white bone tax or baby tax. Families would be driven to sell their daughters, their homes, or even mutilate themselves to avoid the crushing debt. And worst of all was the grain loan system Hwangak, meant for famine relief. In times of hunger, the state would loan grain at interest to be repaid after the next harvest, but the Aemin would systematically steal grain from the silos, mixing the remaining supply with dirt and stones. When the loans were recalled, the poor were forced to repay massive debts for rancid, useless grain they never truly received. The stench of corruption was a physical, palpable thing, fouling the air of every provincial village. This was the backdrop of suffering, the agonizing mingo, the sorrow of the people that Dasan observed. He realized that the intellectual tradition of the Yongbin was bankrupt. Their high-minded debates were nothing more than luxury beliefs, utterly useless in alleviating the real pain of the populace. It was this profound disillusionment that fueled the Silhak movement, the practical learning school. Silhak scholars believed that learning was meaningless unless it led to practical utility and welfare. They demanded empirical inquiry, silsagusi, seeking truth from facts, rejecting the abstract metaphysics of Neo-Confucian orthodoxy. Dasan was the towering apex of this intellectual rebellion, transitioning from theory to the specific, brutal necessities of administrative law. Dasan found a momentary respite from this decay under the patronage of King Jeongjo, a brilliant, reform-minded monarch who cherished Dasan's engineering genius and his commitment to practical policy. This period, before 1800, was the peak of Dasan's political idealism. He supervised the construction of the monumental Hwaseong fortress in Suwon, utilizing innovative Western-influenced machinery like the Jeongjo, a pulley system, to lift heavy stones, a testament to his belief that technology and practical knowledge could transform the state. But the light of reform proved transient. The sudden, premature death of King Jeongjo in 1800 plunged the court into darkness. The conservative factions, led by the enemies of reform, immediately seized power. The year 1801 marked the Sinyu persecution, Sinyu Baki, a ruthless political purge masquerading as a religious crackdown on Silhak, Western learning, or Catholicism. Although Dasan had distanced himself from the faith, his family ties and his association with the reformist faction were enough to seal his doom. The accusation of Western heresy was merely the sharpest weapon used to decapitate the entire Naman intellectual movement. The shock was immediate and devastating. Dasan was dragged from his home, imprisoned and interrogated. The atmosphere inside the capital's prison was a suffocating mix of fear, cold stone, and the distant screams of fellow scholars being tortured. Dasan was not just stripped of his office, he was stripped of his dignity and identity. He was forced to watch his friends and relatives either executed or banished to remote, unforgiving locations. His own fate was to be exiled, not to be killed, but to be slowly starved and forgotten. The journey to his place of banishment, Gangjin, was a terrifying descent into the physical reality of the lower Joseon hierarchy. The long, agonizing trek through the countryside was less a philosophical journey and more a confrontation with the stark failure of the state he had sought to save. Every village he passed, every beggar he saw, every corrupt official who mocked the fallen Yongbin further fueled the relentless hand building within him. Upon arrival in Gangjin, Dasan found himself an unwanted, dangerous guest. His initial dwelling was a wretched space in a seaside tavern, so small and damp that the ink on his paper would not dry. The local people, fearful of political reprisal, shunned the disgraced scholar. He was utterly alone, separated by hundreds of miles from his wife and children in the capital. The first years of exile were defined by profound, agonizing despair. He was intellectually brilliant, yet politically impotent. He was a master of statecraft, yet forced to live in squalor. This emotional paralysis was the initial stage of his transformation. We must enter the scholar's small, dank room. The paper thin, the lamp flickering low, casting long, wavering shadows that danced with the ghosts of his executed friends. He stares at the ceiling, thinking not of abstract principles, but of his own failure. They said I was tainted by the West, corrupted by foreign ideas. They lied. They feared not the Western God, but the truth. They feared a world where merit mattered more than lineage, where competence mattered more than ritual, and now I sit here. This internal shame, the suffocating knowledge that his intellectual prowess had failed to protect either himself or the people he swore to serve, became the ultimate catalyst. He realized that lamentation was a luxury he could not afford. The true scholar's duty was not to mourn the loss of power, but to transform that powerlessness into a more enduring form of influence. If he could not physically implement reforms, he would write the definitive instruction manual for those who could. This was the birth of Silhak practical learning in its highest form, the determined, painstaking effort to synthesize every scrap of available knowledge, historical precedent, Chinese legal philosophy, contemporary observation, into a single, coherent, and practical system of governance. Dasan adopted the pen name Dasan Tea Mountain, signifying the pure, simple labor of cultivation in this desolate landscape. The physical struggle of exile was transformed into intellectual discipline. His writing, now prolific, was an act of intellectual defiance, an attempt to impose order onto the political chaos that had destroyed his life. He set out to write the Mokmin Simseo. This was to be his life's work, a comprehensive, systematic guide for the local official, structured around every phase of the magistrate's tenure, from the moment they assume office to the day they depart. It was a commitment to details so rigorous that it demanded a kind of intellectual sacrifice far exceeding anything required in the easy life of the capital. The Mokmin Simseo is massive, comprised of 12 chapters and 72 detailed articles. This detailed structure reflects Dasan's core belief that administration is not a poetic exercise but a technical discipline requiring comprehensive knowledge. The entire work is built upon three foundational pillars of ethical conduct: Yulgi self-discipline, Bonggong public service duty to the state, and Aemin love for the people. The journey begins with Yulgi, the uncompromising demand for self-discipline. Dasan insists that the magistrate must first govern the territory within his own heart before attempting to govern the territory entrusted to him. We must visualize Dasan meticulously drawing up these codes for conduct. He is not lecturing a novice. He is lecturing the greedy, ambitious shadow self he fought daily during his own incarceration and exile. Listen closely, official, the pages seem to whisper. You must live simply, your clothes should not be luxurious, your meals must be humble. The moment you show a fondness for fine objects, for a handsome horse, or for opulent furnishings, you send a signal to every cunning clerk in your yamen local office. I am corruptible. They will seize this weakness and use it as a wedge to exploit the people in your name. This was not abstract morality. It was an applied strategy of anti-corruption. Dasan, who saw officials prey on the peasantry to finance their own extravagant lifestyles, understood that personal greed was the systemic weakness. He demanded the magistrate manage his own household and staff with the utmost severity, knowing that a servant's arrogance was a direct reflection of his master's moral laxity. Following Yulgi is Bonggong, the duty to the state, but redefined. For Dasan, true duty to the state meant fulfilling the practical mandates, managing the granaries, supervising public works, and administering the census with flawless integrity. He scorns the official who delegates these vital tasks to subordinates, while he retreats to compose poetry or entertain guests. Here, the psychological microscope zooms in on the moment Dasan realized the insidious power of the Aemin local clerks. These clerks, hereditary functionaries, often knew more about the land and law than the rotating magistrate. They were the true, invisible sovereigns of the district, using their expertise for calculated exploitation. Never, under any circumstances, allow your subordinates to control the ledgers. The true corruption does not reside in the capital. It breeds in the local office, where the clerk manipulates the grain records and changes the tax figures in the dead of night. If you do not personally check every register, if you do not walk the fields yourself to verify the yield, you are not merely incompetent, you are an accomplice to theft. This intense focus on administrative detail, the specific rules for weighing grain, the maintenance of the firewatch towers, the meticulous recording of legal precedents, elevated Mokmin Simseo beyond typical Confucian philosophy. It was the world's first serious attempt to transform ethical ideals into administrative science. But the true heart of the text, the spiritual apex of Dasan's philosophy, resides in Aemin, the love for the people. This is where Dasan's personal Jeong, his deep paternal affection born from shared suffering, is translated into political action. The magistrate, Dasan writes, must act as the parent of the people Minuai Bumo. This responsibility mandates active intervention in all areas of the populace's struggle, particularly economic hardship and judicial injustice. Dasan spends hundreds of pages detailing the necessary actions during a famine. A magistrate must not wait for directives from the capital, which might arrive months too late. He must open the granaries immediately. He must ensure that relief grain is distributed fairly, not sold off by corrupt middlemen. He demands that the magistrate inspect the homes of the poorest to confirm the extent of their need, rather than relying on fabricated reports designed to hide the scale of starvation. This Aemin principle extended to the realm of law, detailed in the chapter on judicial administration. Dasan, who himself had witnessed the arbitrary cruelty of Joseon justice, insisted that justice was not about punishment, but about clarity, fairness, and the protection of the innocent. Imagine a poor man, falsely accused of theft, kneeling before the magistrate. In the corrupt system, the verdict was decided by social status or by the bribe offered to the clerk. Dasan demands a different process. The life of one man is heavier than the mountains and more precious than 10,000 ounces of gold. You must hear every detail not with impatience, but with the profound seriousness due to a soul whose fate rests in your hands. Never use torture merely to extract a confession, for the pain will only lead the weak to confess to crimes they did not commit. Dasan's demand for meticulous judicial review, including researching ancient legal precedents, which he detailed in his companion work, Mokmin Simseo, The New Code of Criminal Law, was revolutionary. It sought to remove the arbitrary power of the official's whim and anchor law in reason and empathy. The struggle to write this magnum opus was an 18-year act of spiritual and intellectual endurance. Dasan's small hut in Gangjin was perpetually cold, often short on food, and he was consumed by worry for his distant family. He worked relentlessly, translating his pain into administrative rigor. He spent days observing the local farmers, the rhythm of their planting and harvest. He would calculate the true yield of the fields, comparing it to the official inflated tax registers. He charted the course of local waterways, designing irrigation improvements that the local bureaucracy was too lazy or too inept to implement. His Silhak was not studied from books alone. It was observed in the mud of the rice paddies and the dust of the local market. His intellectual isolation was punctuated only by visits from his eldest son and a few dedicated, impoverished students. To them, Dasan was not a disgraced politician, but a living sage, transforming calamity into wisdom. He taught them that true scholarship lay not in mastering abstract texts, but in solving the tangible problem of securing the people's rice bowl. Dasan's relentless focus on the people, was a subtle yet powerful rebellion against the very foundations of Joseon political ideology. While the elite focused on the vertical relationship between the king and his officials, Dasan forced the focus horizontally and downward. The most important political relationship was between the magistrate and the starving farmer. Failure in this primary relationship meant that the entire state structure, no matter how ritually pure, was fundamentally illegitimate. The Mokmin Simseo evolved chapter by chapter, section by section, forming an intellectual fortress against corruption. It was Dasan's silent, profound challenge to the power structure that had tried to silence him. They had exiled the man, but they could not exile the ideas. The final chapters of the Mokmin Simseo are dedicated to the magistrate's departure, the act of Higuan Haeguan. This section provides the ultimate moment of catharsis and the definitive test of the magistrate's tenure. Dasan advises the official to clear his name meticulously, settling all outstanding debts, leaving behind a flawless administrative record and ensuring no injustice remains unresolved. But the ultimate judgment lies not in the paperwork, nor in the approval of the king, but in the reaction of the common people. Imagine the scene Dasan paints. The magistrate, having served his 3 or 4 years with rigorous self-discipline and profound love for the people, packs his few belongings, adhering to the standard of frugality he established on arrival. As he prepares to depart for his next post, or perhaps for retirement, he approaches the main gate of the district. The final test: does the populace line the road to celebrate his departure, happy to be rid of a greedy tormentor? Or do they weep, blocking his path with their bodies, clutching his humble carriage, begging him to stay? If the people weep, if they cling to his robes and genuinely lament his going, then and only then, Dasan concludes, can the magistrate know that he has succeeded in his sacred duty of Mokmin. This simple, powerful image, the people's tears as the measure of political success, was revolutionary. It placed popular consent, popular affection, and popular welfare above the rigid, self-serving assessment of the centralized bureaucracy. It was Dasan's final act of elevating the common man to the highest authority in the land. Dasan finally received his pardon and returned home in 1818, 18 long years after his banishment. He was an aging man, his health frail, his political friends gone, but he was an intellectual colossus. The man who returned was fundamentally different from the man who left. The youthful prodigy of the court was gone, replaced by the sage of the Tea Mountain, the compiler of the Yoyudangianseo, his vast collected works. He was never fully restored to power, never allowed to implement his grandest designs for central government reform, detailed in his companion work Jeong Yak-yong, but by then it did not matter. His works, particularly the Mokmin Simseo, stood complete, a pristine blueprint for a morally upright state, waiting for a future generation courageous enough to wield its truths. His final years were spent revising his manuscripts, a quiet but profound act of defiance against the political system that had failed him. He had taken his righteous Han, the bitterness of his exile, and sublimated it into objective, practical truth. His personal catharsis was complete not through vengeance, but through the creation of an enduring, uncorruptible body of work. The legacy of Jeong Yak-yong, Dasan, and the lessons of the Mokmin Simseo do not belong solely to the history of Korea. They offer universal, urgent insights into the nature of leadership, integrity, and administrative duty that echo powerfully across centuries and continents, speaking directly to modern challenges in New York, London, Paris, and Seoul. Dasan's central premise, that the local administrator is the true foundation of the state, is profoundly relevant today. In a world of large governments and distant bureaucracies, the daily failure of governance often occurs at the local level. The corrupt police officer, the dishonest contractor, the negligent official who diverts public funds intended for the community. Dasan's demand for Yulgi, self-discipline, is the ancient precursor to modern professional ethics, insisting that public power is a moral hazard that requires rigorous personal vigilance. His critique of the Aemin, the local, low-level functionary who weaponizes administrative complexity for personal gain, is a timeless warning against bureaucratic capture. In the digital age, the Aemin has simply traded the physical ledger for the encrypted file, but the principle remains the same. The technical expert must be strictly bound by the ethical mandate of the public servant. Dasan demanded transparency and simplification to empower the common person against the manipulative expert. Most importantly, the principle of Aemin, love for the people, transcends cultural boundaries. It challenges the purely contractual or utilitarian view of governance dominant in some Western philosophies, which often measure success purely in efficiency or economic output. Dasan demands an empathetic, parental approach. Governance must be rooted in Jeong, in profound human affection for the community. When a modern leader or corporate executive makes a decision, Dasan compels us to ask, does this action prioritize the welfare of the most vulnerable citizens, or does it merely serve the elite at the top? The Mokmin Simseo is a reminder that true political genius lies not in abstract debate, nor in the pursuit of high office, but in the relentless, humble effort to ensure that not a single farmer is taxed unfairly, not a single meal is stolen, and not a single legal ruling is corrupted. Dasan, the exiled scholar, proved that the greatest power of the mind is not the ability to command men, but the ability to articulate a vision of absolute integrity. His life was a tragic sacrifice, a brilliant mind exiled for daring to speak the truth. But in that small, damp hut in Gangjin, Jeong Yak-yong transformed his political ruin into an enduring ethical mandate. He laid down the blueprint for the ideal shepherd, ensuring that the voice of the suffering people would be heard, generation after generation, a powerful, timeless admonition carried on the whispering currents of the Tea Mountain. His final lesson is clear: integrity is not a philosophy, it is an action measured only by the unwavering commitment to the love of the governed.